Gentlemen, here we are again. Another day, another chat. So excited to be here. Chris, firstly, how you doing?
Very well, thank you, Tom. How are you?
Good. I am so happy. I've got a Suava here, so it's a new white. I found this morning on my way home. Here with you
Sounds
guys.
funky.
No place I'd rather be. I haven't actually tried it before. David, great entry, David.
Yeah. Hi, Tom
well,
and Chris.
gents, let's get down to business. So,
Well, I've just finished my coffee and I've started the red, so I'm ready to get down to business now.
David, quickly share with us what you've got there.
It's a McLaren Vale Shiraz.
I was actually talking to Craig from Vintage Cellars on Moggle Road this morning. He was the one who gave me the Suava, and he said McLaren Vale Shiraz.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. I actually picked one up, but he definitely sung its praises.
I picked the second best bottle out of what I have at the moment.
Huge. We're expecting big things from you this afternoon, then.
I'm honoured.
but also,
no, don't be too honoured. You know.
I was going to say, why did you pick the second best bottle?
Why not the first?
I didn't think you guys were worth the best. But you're up there.
Good.
Was
good.
it the second out of two, or
out of about 10? So
all right.
Yeah, that's all right. All right. Well, let's do it. So,
okay, Chris,
let's talk about you. So we're going to talk about we're going to ask all the personal questions about Chris. So
get under my skin. Okay.
Does Chris feel comfortable in his own skin? Does Chris actually believe in God? When Chris, portrays this persona of a happy, charismatic young Catholic, is that really Chris? Can we actually
what do you mean by charismatic?
Oh, I mean, a happy guy.
Do you speak in tongues, Chris?
Right.
Yeah,
I
if
see.
you like. Only on Wednesdays. And today is what day is it today? Saturday today.
It's Saturday, so yeah, not today.
Not happening.
At least
not unless
you'd have to warn us. Yeah, but isn't that what they all do?
That's what they all do.
You pay
to pray.
to see somebody. Yeah, that's it. Dear, that's not what we're about here. So, Chris, can I start by asking? No, I'm going to start by making an assumption that you're a cradle Catholic.
I am. Yeah, that's right.
Okay, well, tell us about that. So, where are you from?
I don't remember much about it, but I was born in Manchester, which is in the north of England, in a town called Oldham, which is quite an industrial. Historically a very industrial town where they used to make cotton, so it's quite a working class sort of town.
What was it called again?
Oldham. O-L-D.
Oldham.
Yeah.
Paint a picture.
Grey. Mills. Like when I was growing up, there was more than 50 mills in the town, all repurposed. They were used as offices, used as warehouses, all different types of things. But at one point, just to give you an idea of what Oldham was like, it produced a quarter of the world's cotton in the 1800s. So it was a big mill town. We were about, to give you an idea, probably about 4 or 5 miles from the city centre of Manchester, which is a large city in the north of England. And I grew up there. I went to a couple of different state primary schools. And then aged 9, my parents didn't love me and they shipped me off to boarding school in the south of England. Yeah.
Where'd you go to boarding school?
I went to boarding school in the opposite end, on the opposite end of the spectrum to where I came from, which was in a place called Hampshire, which is, I think it's one of the most expensive places to live in the UK. A leafy kind of area, part of the country, probably about an hour from London. So it's all the rich commuters buy big millionaire pads out in Hampshire and then commute into London. I went to a traditional Catholic school there for 7 years. So that was why I went there, because it was traditional Catholic.
Okay, so if we just take 2 steps backwards, and just FYI, David, feel free to jump in and chuck some hooks and haymakers.
He's enjoying that. He's enjoying that wine too much.
I did let it breathe.
Good. I'm glad to hear. So Chris, parents, both Catholic on both sides?
Catholic on both sides, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Not much more to add to that.
Not much more. So you would say you had a pretty normal Catholic childhood. Your family took the Catholicism pretty seriously. You were all fairly comfortable in it. There was nothing overly unusual that, looking back now, you notice or you observe about you growing up as a Catholic.
Yeah, only slightly. So yes, to answer the question, it depends how you interpret the word normal Catholicism, but I would say yes.
I was thinking the same thing myself.
So on one side of my family, yes, that was totally normal to grow up as a traditional Catholic. On the other side of my family, we were the only part of the family who opted, if you like, for traditional Catholicism, and the rest of my cousins, aunties and uncles were either nominally Catholic or had fallen away at some point, or are still practicing in Novus Ordo. So I guess that was slightly different. There was always a slight difference between cousins and friends and family growing up in that respect. I mean, we all got on and there was no sort of issues, but we were always sort of doing our own thing, traveling slightly further to Mass than the local parish church where my cousins went to Mass. So in that respect, yes, normal Catholic upbringing from a traditional perspective, not necessarily from a modern Catholic perspective.
Mm-hmm. And not to create any further familial divides, but do you still do you talk with your relatives who, let's say, decided to go with the conciliar route as opposed to tradition? What's the dynamic like there? Do you guys discuss that?
Not particularly, no. And I think that's more because we've just sort of drifted apart in life. So I don't see that side of my family very often. We tend to catch up at Christmas, once a year, and you don't dive into the deep and meaningful topics when you see someone once a year. So, we've well, depends how
I always
much
do, and it's Christmas.
Depends how much of that McLaren veil you've had, I suppose. It has happened. It has happened in the past on certain occasions with certain members of my family, but in general, it hasn't really come up. So yeah, not really. So I moved away fairly young. I was away at school a lot. I only saw them in the holidays, and then as I've got older, I moved away for university, moved away for work. And other things later on in life. So we just don't have that kind of tight-knit relationship. So I'm closer to some of my cousins than others. I speak to some more frequently than others, but in general, it's not that kind of dynamic.
And I've got to say, I'm just going to throw this one across to David because you may not realise, but we have the same last name, and that's not accidental.
Before you do, I think this is an appropriate juncture to say I'd like the hunter to become the hunted, Tom, and I want to throw the question back at you guys. Explain your upbringing, and then we can move on with my life and my story. Tom, David.
Staged and cut up. And when you say the hunter became the hunted, I just want to quickly...
You want to take that Jurassic Park talk?
Yeah, that just had a really Jurassic Park sort of vibe to it. I liked that. The interesting thing about that was David. I'll just cover my part and then maybe throw this over to you. I'm in what I think is a very unique situation where both sides, both my mum and my dad, mums and dad's sides are entirely Catholic, not only Catholic, traditionally Catholic, and not only traditionally Catholic, but they attend and receive the sacraments from the Society of St. Pius X. And I always grew up taking that for granted. But when you hear the story of my mum and my dad, which I'm not going to tell you, but I'm just trying to whet the appetite there because it's quite a good story. Just ask them and they will tell you. And then you look around and you identify what so many people had to go through, the sacrifices people had to make to, find tradition, stay with tradition, and then pass on tradition. It staggers me that both, so David and my dad's five brothers are all traditional Catholic, attend the Society of St. Pius X, and then on my mum's side, mum's one of 5 I think 2 girls. Maybe there's more. This is horrible.
You should know this.
I know.
Guy,
Who have I
Joe,
forgotten?
Tom,
Chris,
Chris.
Mary,
Yeah,
and Mum. How many is that? 6.
6.
Six are all traditional Catholic and attend and receive the sacraments from the SSPX. So that's quite unique. And David, as a dad, what perspective can you add on that point?
Well, yours is a unique perspective. So I grew up surrounded by all my uncles, aunts, cousins on my father's side who were traditional Catholic. So I grew up surrounded by it. You know, I was imbued with it. It was just what was normal to me growing up. On my mum's side, it was different. So none of my uncles or cousins on my mum's side are traditional Catholic. Very few still practice now. There are some who are still Novus Ordo goers. But for yourself, being surrounded by other Catholic or traditional Catholic families should be the normal thing. And yes, it's rare, but it shouldn't be seen as this weird thing. It's really the ideal that we should be aspiring to. So would you say, Tom, that having practically all your relatives who have always been traditional Catholics, has that played a major role in you still having the faith today?
Huge. And I think there's probably a number of different elements to that. I mean, firstly, the annoying thing about being young and growing up is that you don't understand things. That's the phrase "taking things for granted" it's probably more applicable there than any other conceivable area. You just take things for granted. You don't understand why you do what you do. And so looking back now at understanding the uniqueness of the situation I and my siblings were in, the benefits are innumerable in terms of family harmony, in terms of having an underlying infrastructure that maintains family harmony, understanding. And it's really becoming more relevant the older I get, when you start to sort of prod and poke at some of these issues. And, just look at this situation. I'm here having a conversation with an older cousin of mine who I didn't interact with an awful lot when I was growing up, apart from the times when you would, tip me upside down and do things like that sort of scarred my childhood. So while I really have tried to suppress my childhood, the older I get and the further those things get into the past and the more I forget about those things. In all seriousness, though, it's incredible because there is this infrastructure on both sides where it's a safety net, safeguarding the most important possession that you can possibly have, because that's the basis of Catholicism. It's that you are in possession of the truth. And so
it's really the most unifying aspect of life, ultimately. And you should be more unified with family than anyone else. And when you share that unification through the faith, it's an enormous help. Grace.
So, just a question again for both of you. I seem like I'm wearing the interviewer hat now. Sorry, Tom, but we've got to keep this edgy, right? And so to play devil's advocate, like, how would you respond to someone who would argue that, hey, you shouldn't really imbue your kids with this stuff. You should let them choose on their own when they grow up?
Baby stuff, mate. Baby stuff. Because that's where I grew up. I grew up in the world of, the only reason you're religious is because your parents are religious. And that's we were talking about Catholic education last week, and it was a very edgy conversation. And I've had a lot of time to think about things that we discussed. Talk about the excitement is just getting out of control. The the watchers of this interview just really want to see what we spoke about last week, but unfortunately they're going to have to wait about a week to see the edginess that we actually engaged in. But
by the time they see this, they will have already seen the edginess.
We might have to do something about that. But I went to a secular high school, and there was no traditional Catholic high school in existence at the time that I went to a grammar school. That was a decision that my parents came to, and very, very unique decision. But as a result of that, I really had to engage in a lot of those tough issues, because people weren't asking me about, the Trinity and what's virtue, and it was God's ridiculous, and Catholicism is a joke, Christianity is a joke. The only reason you're Catholic is because your parents are Catholic. And one of the answers that my dad gave me to respond to people on that point, because that was the way we did it. I'd get my head kicked in at school, and I'd come home and go, "Oh, Dad, they gave it to me again. I can't believe it." Lost for words in front of all those boys. But if you accept the premise that Catholicism is truth, and that truth is good for you, then a responsible parent would not give their child the choice to arbitrarily accept or reject truth, just for the same reason that a parent's responsible for the health and nutrition of their child. They don't, some parents, David, this may be something you can speak to better than myself, because I don't have a number of awesome, feisty little kids. You do, but I mean, I'd imagine that you don't give Thomas the choice of whether or not to eat his greens if he's at that stage there. If it's nutritious and it's in the best interest of the child, then until the child reaches an age where they have to make those decisions for themselves, the parent has a responsibility to do what is in the parent's mind the best interest of that child.
Yeah.
And so it's really it's the premise. You're almost taking steps backwards and trying to identify a starting position, because if you can convince the person you're arguing with to accept that hypothetically Catholicism is a truth, and a truth worth preserving, then it's the parent's duty to bring their child up and nurture them in that truth. Otherwise they'd be a negligent parent. And I found that, as I think they did, a fairly convincing answer. David?
Yeah, look, I would say that it might sound flippant, but you say, why are you Catholic? And you say, well, my mum and dad were. But that should be the normal course of things. It is something that from the very outset, our Lord handed it down to the apostles, and the faith is something that is handed down through generations, and that should be the normal. I mean, obviously you have conversions, and God gives those graces to people who don't have the fortune of being born into it. But the normal course of things is that the faith should be passed on through your parents as a generational thing. And it shouldn't be looked on. I know the world does look on it as, indoctrination, but you're right in that if you have a conviction, and it comes down to conviction and truth, if you sincerely believe that Catholicism is truth, and that there are the realities of heaven, hell, death, all these things, and that you have a purpose in life, which is to save your soul and enjoy eternal happiness with God in heaven. If you sincerely believe that, then you're right. You have an obligation. There would be a dereliction in your parental duties if you didn't pass that on. And the thing is, there will come a time in every you can probably hear my now.
Your duty.
Yeah, there will come a time in everyone's life where even if it has been given to you by your parents, that you will have to embrace it yourself. You will have to make a decision one way or another to embrace it or not. And that can be a gradual thing where it can be gradual both ways, but at some point you have to make a decision to take it on board and run with it or give it up. But you give your children the best grounding and opportunity to make the right decision by doing the right thing and passing it on and giving them access to the sacraments and all that grace that you need to be able to make the right decisions, especially in today's day and age, which is not just godless, it's anti-God, it's anti-truth.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And just to, maybe we're tangenting just a little bit here. So, but before we throw the ball back at Chris and get him on the back foot, I just want to pick up on something you said, David, because in evangelizing today and engaging in apostolic activity, particularly with non-Catholics, people often come away from discussions and arguments over, euthanasia, abortion, same-sex marriage, religious freedom, scratching their heads, going, we couldn't agree on anything. And that's true. You can't agree on anything because you're getting people start at such a micro level when the whole underpinning premises for these discussions are mutually exclusive. So to be able to have any sort of constructive debate or engage in conversation, you have to step back and back and back to a position where the roads may not necessarily connect, but it's no good talking about euthanasia or a Catholic's rights to go to mass in coronavirus when the person you're discussing with doesn't believe in God.
I think you can. I think you could discuss euthanasia because you could argue on the basis of the natural law, which you don't have to believe in God necessarily to accept. So you might be able to have a constructive discussion about euthanasia, but certainly the Catholic's right to go to mass on Sunday during Corona, probably not.
Chris, no. you've waved a red rag to a bull there, and we're really at risk of tangenting. But maybe let's just do it and have some fun. But because I would argue that the natural law in the absence of God is meaningless, because you really what God gives the natural law is moral direction and shoulds and should nots. Where in the absence of a higher moral arbiter, there's no reason why the biggest dog in the village will not devour and kill all the people under him. The only reason why he wouldn't is because it's not in his best interest to do so. But because there really is nothing stopping him but for his own preservation. So we whatever. I don't know why we went down that track. Sorry. Well, all right. But it's an interesting discussion.
To be continued. Maybe you want to get back on track. I don't
know. Never.
I would just say I don't entirely agree with you, just for the fact that the natural law is imprinted in our nature to a certain extent, and I would say that modern society has found a way to almost mute that perception of the natural law, but it is still there, and I think it still can be activated in people of goodwill. And things like abortion and euthanasia, and even when we're talking marriage as well, these are still issues that relate to the natural law, and that you can still explore with people, whether they're Catholic or not, if they're of goodwill and they haven't, I suppose the other issue with modern society is very few people have the ability to think or reason anymore. And so much of the world is driven by emotion. And again, if you're arguing through emotion, you're never going to have a substantive debate or really change someone's mind or perspective.
Yeah, to borrow the words from DJT, so true, so true. Closing comment.
No,
Yeah.
my turn.
You go.
I was going to say, and David just said very eruditely what I was trying to say. But I think to compare that to a Catholic's right to go to Mass during coronavirus, they're two different things, because that is based upon, I guess, a spiritual duty, a supernatural law. And so it's a different argument that you would have with the same person who may well accept your natural law arguments against euthanasia, but would deny you the right to the sacraments because of a virus that kills hardly anybody. Anyway, different discussion. Over to you.
I'll make one more comment, and then we'll get back on track. So, both the right to attend Mass and the right not to be euthanized are underpinned on the belief that there is a God. So the natural law only receives its authority by virtue of it being instilled by God, because that's what the natural law is. It's the ability to observe in nature God's hand. You take God away, hypothetically, you remove the existence of God, and there is no natural law.
But that doesn't stop you evangelizing someone that accepts the natural law. Right?
No, but my point is, would you accept, and maybe I've never just actually really thought about this hard enough, but if there is no God, natural law is nonsensical, because we only call it natural law and we only observe natural law in the context of it being an observable higher authority manifested in nature.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But people still innately know that theft is wrong, murder's wrong, all these things are wrong. Yes, so they deny God, and if you deny God, then yes, what's the point? Morality disappears.
Yeah, and I guess my ultimate point is that's the brilliance of the natural law, because I think it leads you by necessity to the acceptance of God, because nothing makes sense. It must lead you to God because it is observably and it's patent in nature. So therefore,
agreed. I think we're coming at it from we're coming at it from. I'm on the sidewalk. That's another Americanism. I'm on the pavement trying to convince this person that euthanasia's bad. And then we work back up through the natural law. That person's of goodwill. You're coming at it from the other end of the spectrum, or the other side of the process, which is we start with God, natural law, therefore no euthanasia. But I think we fundamentally agree. Hopefully,
yeah. We hit the crossroads. Let's hit the crossroads. So. Let's go back to Chris. So Chris, you've just been sent away by your parents, whom love you very, very much, to go to a boarding school. So I think they love you. Do they love you?
Of course they do.
Good.
I'm the golden boy in my family, they call me.
I'm glad.
How many siblings do you have?
So I'm the eldest of 6. I've got 4 sisters and a brother.
I always find that the eldest of 6 are always pretty darn good.
Are you the eldest of 6 too? Yeah.
I am the eldest of 6. Yeah.
Awesome.
Awesome.
You think that the eldest of 6 is good? You should meet the third of 7. Jeez. That's a pretty good number.
Two odd numbers there, Tom. That's not good.
But so what was your personal experience growing up as a Catholic? So was it something that you really took for granted while you were growing up, and you only started exploring it the older you got, or talk a little bit about that?
I was a pretty pious kid, actually. I was in the Eucharistic crusade. I was a Eucharistic crusader. I know. I was so boring.
Nerd. No, I was too.
I started serving as soon as I could walk. And I grew up. I just like you really took it for granted. But perhaps just had certain souls have certain inclinations towards different things. I just happened to be inclined towards that when I was a kid. Other people aren't. But I really benefited from the education I received away at boarding school. I didn't appreciate it at the time. I hated being away from home. But
don't mind me, gents. If it looks like I'm texting, I'm just asking Mum to bring the bottle of wine in because I can't leave the show. So
you need fuel. You need fuel.
Tom, you should really look after it yourself.
Dear me. Charge on, Chris. Charge on.
So the question was, when did you first sort of, I don't know, start thinking about it? I think as I left that sort of traditional Catholic school age 16, and I really started to think about it in the following 6 years. So I spent 2 years at finishing off my education in a state college, and then I had a gap year where I worked at my old school. And then I really started to think about things, I think, during that period. So it was like, I certainly remember really kneeling before the Blessed Sacrament thinking, is this real? Like, during the elevation of the host, it's like, do I really believe that? Like that is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ? I don't feel that I believe it. And that made me really scared. That I'd grown up with this, believing in it, and never really thinking about it. And it was a sort of, like David said earlier, sort of a gradual process over the course of between the ages of sort of 17 and sort of 22, where I never stopped going to church or anything like that. I always believed in my faith, but I certainly did a lot more reading around topics like that. So there's a particular book which actually Charlie has been given to read as part of his initiation. We were talking to Charlie on one of the other shows, and it was by a guy called Ludwig Ott. It's called Fundamentals of Catholic Doctrine, I think, and that really goes into the detail of all. Is that subjects.
Denzinger?
It might be, yeah. Denzinger's one of the seminary manuals, so I think it might be. I found it on the shelf at a priory that I was volunteering at. So that I
was about to call you both nerds, but I
won't. Anyway,
no,
so
my brother's the nerd, Tom.
Well, to wrap it up, I guess, that was, to answer your question, where I went through that phase of, like, you've got to think about it. Do you actually believe in it? And, my conclusions were, it was a bit of backwards and forwards over a period of time. And then, it was eminently reasonable. All of my queries were answered. I was able to reason through it. I found the more I've got older, the more I've discovered that Catholicism is based upon very sound structures, scientific structures. You can reason out the existence of God through the use of your natural reason. You don't need some sort of shining light to do that. So the discovery of things like Thomas Aquinas, that's all based on Aristotelian philosophy, and it all makes perfect sense. I mean, there's no viable alternative to it. It's definitely true. That was my period of discovery, exploration, worry, and whatever. I think the only thing I would add, which might be, I don't know if you want to go into this, but I also went through a period of scruples when I was a teenager, which was quite an interesting thing to look back on. It was horrible at the time, but probably for about a period of 2 or 3 years where I saw God as this kind of fiery fury in the sky, and if I missed a sin in confession, that he was going to pull the rug from under me, and that was it, fire and brimstone for eternity.
That would be interesting to talk about, because that has never been something. Maybe I'm giving away too much information, and I've never struggled with that. So what is that? I've prayed for it, and I think my mum has prayed for it for me.
But scruples, no, you don't want it.
Scruples. It's like, Tom, I wish you had scruples. Tom, pray for sorrow. That was always it. But no. Let's take a couple of steps back.
Go on, David. I just ask Chris one thing? You say you took more of an interest in it, started reading more, probably in late teenage years, early adulthood. Was that something that a decision or something that you took of your own volition, or were you pushed? Did you have good priests or family members who really encouraged that or pushed that with you? Because for me, I was really pushed in early adulthood by a particular priest who really encouraged us through a youth group to start reading more about the faith and the crisis in the church specifically, and it was in conjunction with some Ignatian retreats. That's really what spurred me to really start properly taking it seriously as an adult. But it wasn't something that I pursued myself. I was pushed to it, and I thank God for that. But I took some prompting, because I definitely took Catholicism for granted growing up.
To answer the question, I think I was prompted, but in a different way. So I was prompted by the schooling that I'd had, and by being in that environment. So I made sure, like at university, that I surrounded myself outside of the classroom with friends who were traditional Catholics. Broadly speaking, no, I wasn't exclusively that way. I had a lot of friends who were non-Catholic as well. But I think when I started to have questions about the faith, I knew where to find the answers. So yes, I did it of my own volition, but I knew where I could go to read those answers and where I could find them. And that, I think that was grace that pushed me in that direction, but it was based upon the education that I'd had. I was just
that foundation that your parents and your education had laid.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Interesting.
And when you talk about those crisis moments you had, to what extent, crisis in parentheses, to what extent did you struggle? What was it, idle musings, I wonder if, or was there a serious concern on your part that this may not be real?
Yeah, I think so. I've got I'm pretty sanguine as a character, but I do have a bit of a melancholic streak, which, if unchecked, becomes can develop into worry and as happened when I was early teenager years, scruples. So I think it was an initial kind of a thought popped into my head. What if this is all just a load of rubbish? And then initially you can bat that away and be like, no, it's not. And then it kind of preys on your mind, and then it develops into a worry. And that's the point I got to, where it was a real kind of mental battle. Like, no, it's definitely true. I mean, I remember struggles like that during that early adult period, and that was sort of resolved by various books that were read, conversations. If specific issues came up, I would go and speak to a priest if necessary. I can't remember a specific occasion or subject, but yeah, that's how it kind of manifested itself. And then over a period of time, it stopped, because I managed to kind of answer all and worry is never a good sign. You know where that comes from if you've read the Discernment of Spirits. You know that comes from a bad place. So you're given these points of these anchor points. The faith gives you these tools to be able to deal with that. So yeah.
Rice or a biscuit. Sorry.
That's okay.
No, I have crackers.
Yep.
4 crackers.
Give him a cracker. Give him a cracker, David. We're watching.
They can have whatever they want, as long as they leave me alone.
There you go. Parenting 101.
Yeah.
You're gonna love it.
I think I know everything now. Sorry, go on.
Chris, now there's the part where people struggle with the belief in God. Did you ever struggle with the idea that you were able to live a Catholic life? Because I think for a lot of people, if you confront and you start questioning the belief in God, the obvious recourse you should have, as you will have when you question anything in nature or in life that you believe in, is you'll do the research. But it's a question of whether or not it's worth doing the research for. So if you don't understand a concept in schooling or in university or in work, it's worth doing the legwork to resolve that, because you have to. Whereas with religion, it just seems to be, with Catholicism, people aren't vested in it enough to go to the pain of resolving those questions. Because I would 100% agree with you, and I'm sure David would echo your sentiments, that Catholicism has never come up short. And to my mind, that's one of it is truth. So it's the most forceful thing underpinning Catholicism, as opposed to anything else. There is no question. It's all that it can't answer. It's all encompassing. It is truth. So it's not the truth of it that people struggle with. It's what it would mean to engage in that inquiry. So have you ever struggled with the consequences of being a Catholic?
No, not particularly. I mean, not aside from the normal struggles that we all have in the spiritual life. I was fully invested in the Catholic faith. Let's not be under any illusion. I went on multiple pilgrimages. During this period I'm talking about, I was volunteering at a Catholic orphanage in India. I wasn't a kind of half-hearted Catholic. I wanted it to be true. But there was the burning question. I've got to be honest and make sure it is. But no, I mean, the consequences in terms of, this would allow me unlimited license to do what I like in life. No, that was never really an attractive concept for me. No.
There you go.
And before you go on, let's turn it back on yourselves. Any crisis moments? How did you guys, I mean, David's touched on it a little bit. How did you guys, fully commit to the Catholic faith, and when?
David?
Well, I sort of went into it a little bit earlier. For me, I mean, again, I was surrounded by it growing up. I was given everything on a silver platter, really. I was born into traditional Catholicism. I had the traditional sacraments, access to the sacraments my entire life. For me, and I think this is a very important topic, is for me, what was the catalyst, I think, to really start taking my faith seriously was at youth group once. So similar to Chris, I lived a traditional Catholic life. I was fully imbued with it. I was surrounded by it. I took it seriously, but I did also, growing later in life now, I look back and I realized, I absolutely took it for granted. What prompted me to really start looking into it deeply and taking it seriously was at a youth group meeting that I attended. The priest said, why do you go to the Society of St. Pius X? And we all looked, and at a very superficial level, we could give an answer. There was things wrong with the Second Vatican Council, and the Latin Mass is the best version or rite of the Western Catholicism, and it's a much more perfect expression of the Catholic faith than the Novus Ordo. But it was very superficial, and I realized at the time, this is very superficial, and why do I go to the Society of St. Pius X, for example? And, it was something I'd done all my life. I'd grown into it, and I'd never really had to specifically question it. I know my dad and our uncles, Tom, had over the years mentioned or spoken about why it is that they did it, but it was something, yes, interesting to an extent, but not something I'd ever really considered or looked into in any great depth myself. And so it was this question, and it was like, well, why do I? There's a large Catholic world out there that in a sense we can be seen to shun and being very insular, and to an extent there's some truth to that. But after we were asked this question, we were told, here's a copy of the first chapter of They Have Uncrowned Him by Archbishop Lefebvre. And, it was like we were given some homework. Go home, read this over the next month, and next meeting we'll start talking about it. And for me, it was that prompting to start. That was a prompt, and this same priest pushed Ignatian retreats very heavily, offered a lot of Ignatian retreats, and that was something I had been on an Ignatian retreat when I was 17 or 18, and I certainly got a lot more out of my second and subsequent retreats when I was older and I'd started to take my faith a little bit more seriously. And it just sort of went on from there. And through Ignatian retreats and priests, you know, I and other people were given reading lists and recommended reading. If you want to read about the spiritual life, if you want to read about the crisis in the church, these are your staple resources, and start, you know, reading up on these things. Do the work to educate yourself. So that was the prompt for me. What about yourself, Tom?
David, before I let you sneak away into the background that easily, I just want to ask you one more question. Was
Sure.
Bearing everything you've just said in mind, what impact did meeting the beautiful, wonderful Marcella have on that whole set?
Well,
circumstance?
so that was probably a consequence of.
That's your wife, right? I'm just going to ask.
Yes.
Okay.
It's
just checking.
Sorry.
That was a consequence of me taking a renewed interest and seriousness in faith. And Marcella was herself a traditional Catholic, and by that point, you know, I didn't muck around too much as a young person, but you know, I got to a point there in my early adulthood where I was thinking to myself, if possible, I want to date and marry someone else who has the same understanding, convictions as myself. So, and you know, there's always an element of providence in that. And I met Marcella through mutual friends in Sydney, and yeah, I mean, she was given a very good traditional Catholic formation and upbringing by her parents. She wasn't born into it, but sort of through her parents came into it in her early teenage years. So yeah, it was just something that cuts out a lot of the potential issues when you're courting and looking for potentially a wife or husband, because it is so important and it's such a help when you have that unity of ideas, convictions, faith, everything that goes with it. So I wasn't really looking outside traditional Catholic circles. Now, I'm not saying that can't work. I mean, my mum is an example. She was not traditional Catholic when she met my father, and she was Catholic, but certainly in no way even disposed to tradition, but came around to it. So it is possible. But for myself and, you know, providence at play, I suppose I was trying to look for someone who was like-minded. And that was a flow and effect from me starting to take my faith seriously in my early 20s.
Tom, you've avoided it for long enough. Your turn.
Yeah.
This is interesting. And there are certainly elements of it that actually make me sort of quite uncomfortable, because I grew up, my parents gave me what I believe is the best possible Catholic foundation that they could have given me, but both in terms of the educational perspective. David, pour one for me too. The educational perspective, but also the nurturing, the love, that really warm family environment that every Catholic child should have. I think a lot of things started for me the minute I was placed in an environment where my Catholicism was challenged, and which was well, I'm trying to think. Was it actually when I went to Ipswich Grammar? I played a lot of club sport growing up, and there was no secret that I was the only kid on the sports team that went to mass on Sunday, even though I knew that some of the parents of the kids and consequently some of the kids were Catholic. They went to a Lady of the Rosary, the local Catholic school, but I didn't. I went to a different Catholic school, and for some reason I was the only one out of. I won't actually say all of them, because I may not be 100% right, 100% right on that point. But I definitely would have been. We practice our Catholicism in a different way. So I was aware of that, but I never really thought about that until I think I went to Ipswich Grammar, because I made some of my best friends who are still my best friends are non-Catholics, and the way we approached our Catholicism in our household, it was very open, it was very fluid. The knowledge of Catholicism was never something that caused me great worry. And I think I've got to give a lot of thanks at this point in time to my dad, because even if there was an issue that I didn't know how to answer, my dad was and still is just my absolute hero. I knew I go home, Dad's going to be there, we're going to sit down, and he's just going to fill me with this knowledge, and I'm going to come back to school tomorrow and bam, I'm going to dazzle them with this Catholic brilliance, because Dad's there. So maybe before I take the next step, there were definitely times when my knowledge and my I could no longer take my Catholicism for granted, because you do confront intelligent kids, different types of intelligence, but intelligent kids that don't believe in God and believe that your belief in God is ridiculous. So it makes you wonder, gee, and then it occurs to you for the first time that I am the minority. It's entirely possible that I'm the only one in, how big was the school, 1,500 boys, that actually believes in God and tries to, live out this system of life that incorporates the belief in God.
What about your brothers? Were they there as well?
That they were.
So you weren't the only one.
I wasn't the only one, but that's actually a really good point, because it was the familial bond that got me through and got us all through. Because some people, the objection could be raised, and it would be a very, I think a good point is, how could you survive in such a environment that was, possibly hostile towards religion? And
I know a lot of people who don't.
It was secular. Yeah. As do I. It was definitely secular, but it was the family unit. We came home and we were so comfortable in each other's company and so supportive of each other, and we had such confidence in our parents and what our parents believed that we had no qualms. Maybe it was personality based. We had no qualms about going back out there and, stepping down into the trenches the next day, believing these principles and beliefs that nobody else did. So while there were definitely times, it was at high school that I got stuck into Aristotle and Aquinas because I had to. It was sink or swim. It was.
Can I ask, what can you describe what that looks like? You say I'm getting into Aristotle and Aquinas. That's something that you took on yourself.
Yeah, definitely. I think the way people respond to these things are very personality based, which David is a parent. I'm not a parent, but I can imagine that's the importance of parents understanding their kids' personalities and how to work them and get the best out of them. Because for me, I've always been a little bit egotistic. competitive.
Certainly compared to Greg.
Greg's perfect. We all wish we could be like Greg, but very few of us can, and I could not. But for me, it was, somebody's just told me that the whole story underpinning my existence and way of life is not true. So what do you do about that? My response was to go, oh, sorry, mate, you're not getting away with that one. I'm going to find out if there is anything to what you're saying. So a great author who was the first, I'd say, philosopher that introduced me to Aquinas and other philosophers was Edward Feser.
Oh, yeah.
And I loved him. His works on Aquinas and Locke, and really took complex philosophical ideas and made them palatable and gave them practical application. And I've gone on from Feser, but I still definitely have recourse to his works still today. I've got a very close friend who I've lent out one of his books to. But that was one aspect of it. To me, the other aspect, and perhaps the more damaging aspect, is making that decision of it's really choosing God or the world, and that's something that never stops. And that's the pull of friends, the pull of pretty girls, the pull of status, the pull of opportunity, and that the Confessions of Tom. Not that I ever achieved status or took advantage of great opportunities, but that's been something that I have always struggled with, and I still struggle with. But I do think over time I've fingers crossed I've come a long way. But going through school, going through university, I had a great time. Some of my best mates from school, from university, still very, very close. We went out, we had a great time. And yeah, I really look back and you go, I don't want to divulge, but you do things and you have experiences and you go through periods of your life that make you almost come to a crossroads, and you have to make a choice, and you have to take into account what the consequences of those choices will be. And I still choose, and I still try to choose to maintain the practice of my Catholicism. And once you've done that, there's a relief, there's a comfort, there's a satisfaction. And my experience has been that when you don't choose that, there's a mental anguish, a torture, and an emptiness. And so I don't know what you asked that led me to tell you all that.
I would just say that regardless of whether you struggle with those fundamental aspects, the intellectual aspects of the faith and Catholicism, and it, by the sounds, none of us have really had significant issues in terms of the intellectual aspects of Catholicism or the faith. But everyone is always going to face the world, the flesh, and the devil. So they are always going to be in your life, and you're always going to have to face up to them. And, we're all sinners, so we are going to fall at times. But you're never going to be free of that, even if you have the strongest intellectual conviction in your faith. And yes, that should then translate in, I'm going to do the right thing and I'm going to obey the commandments and all of this. But, there is original sin, and we now carry around with us a fallen human nature. So we are always going to have this struggle against the world, the flesh, and the devil.
I think, I would add to that. I when Tom, you were going through that kind of exposure moment, I was thinking, crumbs, I've not been honest, because I had those struggles too. But Yeah, especially at university, but also just before that. And I like a good time. I like going out drinking with my mates, that sort of thing. And there's all. If you're a typical bloke in the modern world, you're probably going to go to excess in one point or another. It's like David's just outlined. It makes me think of some of the great kind of I wouldn't say saints, but certainly scholars, like Oscar Wilde, for example, who had big problems in certain areas, but reputedly always was convinced of the Catholic faith and converted on his deathbed. I think, yes, I mean those are different struggles. There are many stories of people who are intellectually convinced, but then struggle with the more material things.
So true. And I don't think it's accidental at all that they say faith, hope, and charity, and the greatest of these is charity. And I think that gives some sort of or that really highlights the importance that personal interaction plays in the salvation narrative of every individual soul. Because I honestly, if I was to be honest and reflect on my whole life, I would say that the maintenance of my faith is due to the love that my parents gave me, the support that my parents gave me, and that the kind turns that relatives and Catholic friends have given me. I don't think it takes an awful lot to look around and look at people who have fallen away. And I think it doesn't take too much to identify that it was never necessarily a faith-based struggle. There was just something more that they felt that their Catholicism wasn't giving them, which is such a shame. But I think that's a real sort of call to arms for a lot of Catholic individuals, because that's what Catholic is. We're one big Catholic family.
And I think if you don't,
I don't know if anybody said that, but
if you don't, it's a bit fuzzy, isn't it? But if you don't take care of your faith, then you do risk losing it. There are certain sins which dull the intellect, and they are the sins that young people get involved in if they're not careful. Mm-hmm. So you're kind of going down a certain road. If you don't pull the reins and sort of have to think about what you're doing, then you lose that opportunity to actually think things through, because your intellect is dulled. And anyway, conversation for another time, maybe.
Yeah.
Huge. That was really interesting. We went to a lot of different places, and there was some awkward moments. There was some, so if this was what do they call it, like 10 a.m. TV on a Monday, the mothers would be sitting on the couch bawling their eyes out. Look
and we only got to early adulthood.
That's true.
Huge. Well, I mean, any closing remarks or any uncharted territory that somebody wants to quickly jump into and navigate?
I don't know. I mean, where do you go from there? It's we could do a part 2, maybe.
We could. We're always up for part 2s. One closing observation. And it's been an idea that I've just been. I'm sure I'm not the first one to have had it, because I think I borrowed the phrase from somebody. I can't remember who it was, but it's the science of Catholicism. Catholicism is all-encompassing. There's no area of life that it doesn't touch and infiltrate, and it does so in such a exhaustive way, such a forensic way, because if you look at the literal, the philosophy and the theology of the existence of God, there are polemic works written that what we would all suggest make very reasonable, strong arguments for the existence of God. But then you talk about the natural law and a lot of the other consequences of the natural law, fallen human nature, things that people may not really understand. But looking around at the world today, and a lot of you'd say far left greenies actually acknowledge some of the same things. They go, those animals are actually so much better than those people who do so many horrible things and evil things. And in a ridiculous way, there's an element of truth to what they're saying, because people really make a mess of things. But the only thing that exists that places that in a context where you can make sense of it and do something about it is Catholicism. And it has ideas and it has terminology, original sin. I remember having a drink with a mate who has previously come on this podcast. And he was, asking about, what you've got different forms of sin. I mean, what the heck? That's getting a little bit nitty gritty. And you've got different sorts of grace. It's just like a computer game where you level up and you score some sanctifying grace. And I said that very funny, good one. But the reality is that these are different concepts, and if you remove the terminology, the underlying concept makes perfect sense. Catholicism just goes the next step and makes it easy for us by applying a term to it so that we can identify it and we can incorporate it into this framework that we can apply in our lives. And there just isn't anything else that comes remotely close to doing that.
I think my closing comment would be, you've just inspired me there, Tom, would be that I think for any Catholic who's a cradle Catholic growing up, who sort of goes through this phase of taking it for granted, you almost inevitably start to silo your Catholicism, and it's sort of what you do on a Sunday, it's what you do at the family, you don't necessarily do it at the workplace or in school. And when you go through this kind of discovery phase, if for want of a better phrase, where you have to come face to face with reality, and once you get through that, you get into this period, these golden uplands where your faith does become what you've just described, where it influences everything that you do, the way that you eat, what you choose to eat, what you eat on certain days, who you socialize with, where you choose to work, everything. The choices that you make. I mean, David had a beautiful example of, making a conscious effort to find someone who's like-minded to settle down with and have a family with. And so once you make that decision, it's very liberating, as we discussed with Charlie on the previous podcast. But I think that would be my closing remarks. It's actually a beautiful struggle to go through, and to have had that experience is a grace in and of itself. That's my closing sort of statement.
I'll just add, sort of following on from Chris there, is that, the world is in such turmoil in this pursuit of what is really an illusory freedom. The world wants no constraint from anything, but the reality is once you accept Catholicism and these transcendent truths, and you truly accept them, and you attempt to orient your life to fit around those truths, it makes life, I won't say easy, but it makes life simple, and it's truly freedom.
Beautiful.
It's the embracing truth is freedom.
Well, they say the truth will set you free.
Yeah. And yes, embracing the truth will mean certain things are off limits, but that's not a constraint really when you drill down into it. And accepting these truths and living the faith it adds meaning and simplicity to your life. And I think that's just something that is so foreign to the world today.
Tom, mea culpa, to use some Latin Catholic terminology, I've dominated, and that was part of the game plan, right? Let's not lie. I've dominated a little bit this podcast in terms of asking you questions on an equal footing. I'm going to hand it all back to you now. I don't want it. It's yours. Your final comments, and then I'll end the recording.
Nah, you're just going to let me close up, because that's exactly what I want to do, guys. That was thoroughly enjoyable. I enjoyed it. It was a bit different. It was very interactive.
I hope I haven't sullied Charlie's name. with my late substitution.
No, it was terrific, David. Lots of insight provided.
Yeah, very strong substitute bench we've got. It's good.
It was huge. We have a deep roster. We have a very, very deep roster here in the lounge room. My glass is empty, so that's probably an opportunity. That's
not quite. Finish it off. There we go.
Now it is empty. The bottle never arrived, so I'm not an alcoholic, but I need to go refill my glass. So this might be an opportune moment to wrap it up. And guys, I really look forward to seeing you all again in the lounge room. Until next time.
Thanks, Tom.
Not a problem. Thank you, Tom.